All right. As you most of you know, we are doing a little bit of a review of the 4 values that are core for us at St. Andrews. Last week, Dick sort of gave a history as to how we sort of the process and what we went through. Scott kind of added to that, and then when he talked about the worship value, and then Anne talking about discipleship.
Have you defined values?
I can define it a couple of ways. When I taught a class on values at LBI a long time ago, values were defined as that which actually influences your behavior. If something is really a value, or is something that it's not just a priority or a belief system. We can believe lots of things. It's like for me, believing that exercise is a good thing. But if you never see me doing it, it's not a value. It's simply a belief, and you can hold many beliefs. So a value is something that actually must influence your behavior, your decisions. Yeah, it becomes something that anyway. It's important enough to actually influence what you do in your time, your energy, and your resources is defined in terms of your behavioral mode of how you express your values. Time, money, energy, etc.
Thank you.
All right. Today we're going to look at the word on outreach. And I do like words. And thank you, Marvin, for asking about words. In many churches, they tend to, sometimes we've heard the language, there's an in-reach, which kind of governs certain kinds of programming. And then there's outreach, which governs other kind of programming. Because sometimes I've had actually someone down at the Lantern Hill group when we asked about what is outreach, and normally it tends to be associated with that which is anything about that is from our community and out beyond our membership, out beyond. It's not just beyond the building; it's beyond the membership, and so that it's beyond our faith community in that way. Outreach specifically is intent on that. It's not saying that you don't do outreach. You don't do outreach with worship. Obviously, you do. It's proclamation. It's sharing, and certainly with discipleship. Also, I mean, there's outreach in that involved as far as children and friends and all of those things involved. But when we say outreach, for us, it's at St. Andrews. It's the programming that we do that is specifically focused on those needs, et cetera, beyond our community. While we don't feel those 2 values are only there, that ministers within the other values certainly also have outreach element to it. So does that make sense? Okay. I'm gonna screen share. This is courtesy of Scott Lester, who gave us this nice little layout. And so you see that we started with worship, we went to discipleship, and then we went to outreach. And the statement that we wrote was serving and loving our neighbors with generosity and justice by sharing of our gifts from God. And when we got into thinking about the biblical basis for outreach, you've seen the other biblical bases that are there. We thought we'd start with Jesus. We thought that was a good place to start, and to look at the things that Jesus was concerned about, that we ought to also be concerned about it. And I added one here because in the greatest commandment out of the Matthew passage, it's when he talks about you shall love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and this is the greatest and first, but there's a second is like it, which says you shall love your neighbor as yourselves. That out of Jesus' mouth also speaks to which not just a matter of loving God, it is also loving your neighbor. And as you love your neighbor, you love God. As you love God, you are loving your neighbor. And so this was one of our discussion issues. The 2 that we centered especially on in what Jesus said is to follow Jesus' example out of Mark 10, when it says amongst the disciples he's talking, and he says, it's not among you whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all, a slave or servant of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. It's our purpose for existing. It's why we are in discipling It is our purpose for being disciples, which was to serve. It is to give. It is to let the outreach for it's God blesses us and we pass it on to others in that context. And the other one was Matthew 25, which we list as verses 35 to 40 especially, which is sort of describing some of the needs that people have. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison, you visited me, etc. And then when he comes down, and when was it we saw you in these situations? And the king answered, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And that for us, those two passages especially kind of laid it out for us as far as in our concern or the kind of things that focused the kind of outreach ministries we wanted to be a part of. And from the Joshua process and from Scott's exercise about prouds, what we're proud of in St. A's, one of the first things people sat in the table groups and they talked about our outreach activities. They talked about our housing thing. They talked about HopeLink, our commitment into many of these areas that folks are genuinely proud of in that regard. And in doing so, if you recognize this is in our voice that Susan puts out, and at the very top, usually around page 15, this comes off of 15 in the Vebra voices, but here it establishes our core ministries. And these were identified for us maybe several years ago that we decided we needed something to kind of be a basis to kind of focus what we felt was our unique DNA for St. Andrews. What were the things that we had passion about? What were the things that that kind of summarize up our unique kind of outreach intentions in a deliberate way? And so we have 5: affordable housing and homelessness, food security or hunger issues. The Christian education and nonprofits was the idea of training and something which is going to, instead of just feeding people, the whole analogy about you give a fish, you feed a person a day. Well, you teach someone to fish and you can help them a lifetime. It was looking at educational nonprofits in that way that could help actually work within systems. Other local ministries, which were some of the listing I'm going to show you, and then certainly global mission, that we have both a domestic side of our outreach, but also a global side, that we don't forget people beyond our borders. You see this ministry prayer focus, every single voice, which means each month we select a bridge minute or a focus for our prayer focus. And in November, it's Bridge Disability Ministries. And so I just wanted to put that in there because every time in our voice, you can look for that to see that as part of it. One of the things we added this year was when our Outreach and Servant Ministries Committee meets, there's about 11 or 12 of us. And this is a group of people that have joined. We're always open for more people to join the Outreach Committee. I think any committee is always open for people, depending upon what your passion and your desire is in which you can actually do something and serve. For us in the outreach, we each carry a certain liaison for each of these different kinds of ministries. And we're always getting requests. We're always getting asked for people bring up, well, let's support this or let's support that. Well, what we did this fall, I think, Dick, was September, is we summarized all this finally and put together a criteria and some of the kind of questions we use for determining our continued relationship with projects and organization. So the first thing obviously is our 5 core values. And if it's one of those things, how do they align with our core ministries? Then the other things we asked was how regular the communication acknowledgement. We wanted to have a partnership with them. And so we wanted communication. Third, one of the things we're really careful about is there needs to be, we think, some member of the committee or the congregation who is involved with the organization and can serve as a liaison. We need people who have that as their passion so that they can honestly feed it back into the congregation. Number 4, how does it provide for members to be involved beyond financial donations? One of the things we discovered in our Joshua group is that we're an activist kind of a group. We like to volunteer. We like to do things about our faith. And then finally, the issues about obviously, you check the financial accounts. We regularly look at their annual reports in terms of how the money is used, what's a percentage of overhead. We do that kind of fact checking. There's an accountability thing about the nonprofit. Some of them have nonprofit ratings. And then finally, how they're, if they have an organizational assessment of their staff and operations, are they looking at themselves to ask, can we get better at this? How do we do this? This is a copy out of our 2020 budget. So it shows you now how we've aligned all these different ministries that we're currently committed to on a long-standing relationship. And you see the housing and hunger one at the top. You then see educational kind of outreaches. You see the organizations. These are the local ministries that we're involved in under that place. Then there's the global piece under those particular ones. Then we always have a new opportunities because there's always things that are happening that come on a special need. And so this is, for example, when we can send, let's say, $500 for a special need, that we don't look at it as a long-term budget. We don't look at it as a long-term relationship, but this is something that we have so that we can do kind of a quick response. And so this sometimes I know that we've done some money out of here with for the Navajo Evangelical Lutheran Mission when they were in the midst of the worst part of the pandemic, which was, and there's, feeding people. So especially relief or Lutheran disaster response, if they come with something of that nature, this is where the money would come from, how we allocate that. And the last one, of course, is our relationship with a larger church. So that money is allocated to the Synod, our Northwest Washington Synod. We see ourselves as partners together with them. And so that they, I think, Pastor, what is it, 60, 65 synods in the entire US ELCA.
65.
We can get more done if we work together on this whole thing than if we just try to do it individually on our own as an individual church. And if you look at the bottom, our percentage of the budget, we've always aimed to be about 10%. Some people, you can call it a tithe. We just simply always kind of look at that as wanting to give beyond our borders, beyond, not just simply for in-reach and for our own needs, but also to be able to give beyond. And so you see this in on the back of the voice. Every single voice has our mission and values. It has the 4 values here. It has some of this information. But if you look at the bottom, this is why I wanted to include this. You've got all the different icons of the different local ministries that we're involved in. And from Lutheran World Relief, which we've always been connected with that. These last 3-4 years, we've been involved with Bahar Project, but Lutheran World Relief has many other kinds of projects. And so that over the years, this has been a consistent relationship. And then in the last couple of years, we've become a safe place for youth. And so that icon is there. And then this kind of shows what you have here at this point. Questions? That's sort of, unless anybody has any questions about this. Now, questions, comments? Otherwise, we move on to Pastor, and she's going to share about relationships, which is the 4th value that came out of our process.
All right. So the other core value that we have identified for our congregation is relationship. And for us, what that means is living as a compassionate community, sharing God's forgiveness and acceptance of all. And there are 2 Bible verses that are tied to it. The first is from John chapter 13. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And the other scripture is from Colossians chapter 3. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And what these scripture verses do is remind us again of what it means to live in relationship with each other. And more concretely, it looks like the other core values that we've identified. It looks like coming together for worship and for outreach and discipleship activities. It is praying with and for each other. It's actually practicing forgiveness and compassion, not just talking about it. It's remembering that our decisions affect each other, that what we decide doesn't only affect us as individuals, it affects the community. And it also looks like having conversations about difficult issues while being respectful of each other. And I wasn't a part of the conversations that helped identify these values, but I offered to speak on this one because this is the one that matters to me the most. And the reason it's the one I hold most closely is that we can't live into any of the other values or our mission statement without relationship. And specifically remembering that the relationships we have are with God, with others, with creation, and that we are all interconnected all at the same time. None of the rest of what we do happens without remembering those relationships and the work that it takes to go into creating them and maintaining them. And I've been complimented for my sermons for their brevity and their conciseness. This presentation is equally as brief and concise. So I'm going to stop the screen share and open it up for questions. Any questions? Yeah, Jean. You're muted.
Yeah, as soon as I can figure out how to do that again. If you were to say, having for many of us now been away from each other in terms of face-to-face contact, what would you say which should be some guiding things to think about or to consider as we come back together to see each other now face-to-face in terms of either building or renewing or relationships?
So we have all changed as a result of this pandemic. Some of the changes we're aware of, some of them are still unfolding, some of them we have no clue and we won't until we're back together. And I think it's to remember that everyone without question has been changed by this pandemic. Mm-hmm. And we did not go through those changes in the same physical space. We went through them in our individual homes, pods, however you want to identify that. So in our core, we'll be coming back as the same people who left in March. But there will be some subtle changes. Some of us are going to be really happy to be around people right away. Some of us are not going to be comfortable with that. And I guess don't be afraid to check in with each other. I mean, even now, don't assume that people are checking in on each other. If somebody's on your mind, call, send an email, text, and check in with them and find out how they're doing. And when we come back, again, assume that everyone has changed, because we have. Like I said, some of the changes we're aware of and some of them are not. So.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. So I have the opportunity now to talk a little bit about how we're going to live into each of these values that we've identified. And the good news is we already have been for many, many years. It's just now we've been able to go through a process to put a name to these values and bring some organization to it so that we can intentionally live into them as well as externally promote them. And so I will bring my presentation up now. So this is a quick refresher here on the, excuse me, I'm trying to organize my screens. go. All right, so just as a quick refresher, the values are worship and discipleship, outreach, and as Pastor just shared, relationship. So when you value, when organizing a group like our congregation around our values, we go through a very intentional process. And these are some steps that are broadly recognized as being best practices for going through those intentional steps. First, you have context and buy-in. Then you go through workshops and establish parameters. Then you collaborate and refine. And finally, you adopt and simmer. And we've gone through those first four steps. And now we're in that spot where we're ready for the big reveal. And while we've adopted these values and we've had the opportunity to simmer and live into them, we haven't really done the big reveal on our values like we did for our mission statement early on. The second part, or the next step, is to engage and live out, and then finally share externally. So I'm going to go through these final three steps so that we can have an understanding of what it is that we can do to individually and as a community in Christ live out these values. So the big reveal. We'll make a big deal out of our values. And, in many organizations that I'm familiar with, sometimes they'll actively promote their mission statement, and then the values might be kind of buried. And many people in that organization may not even realize what their values are if you were to stop by their office and ask them. And when we were collaborating on the development of the values, we had a very intentional discussion about what can we do to make our values recognizable so that they're not vague or veiled, that we all understand what they are and we can easily promote them. We'll want to feature our values during times that we're together, maybe in Bible studies. So maybe as we have a Bible study, we select a various book or text and focus that's focused on a particular value and put some concentrated study into it. We might challenge our congregation members to self-identify how they can support carrying out our values. Invite the congregation to offer thoughts on how they will promote St. Andrew's values externally in an authentic way. So really, it's not just talking to each other about values, but asking people to answer some very specific questions. And then talk about our values at home. For example, we're currently going to be doing some exercises during our stewardship campaign this fall that invite you to do some reflection on stewardship, and by that same token, we'll might have an opportunity to talk about how our values are reflected in our let's say normal life and the life we're living now in a pandemic. Did anybody have anything that they wanted to ask about the initially promoting our values? Okay. So then engagement and living out. And this is the fun part. So part of this is consistency and consistently address and reference our values, committee meetings, church communications, and dialogue. Jean also already promoted various ways that we're doing that with regard to outreach. And so again, we're already doing a lot of this. It's just now we have the opportunity to recognize what it is. And then promote our values in worship and with each other. And Pastor, in her sermon message today, very clearly emphasized our values during the sermon. Internal testimonials. This is part of what Dick talked about last week, where we have there's a specific framework that was introduced to us that helps us to maybe measure our vision as a congregation. And the vision team decided that the typical measurement where what some congregations do is they measure by tithing, or how many people are logging into an online service, or how many people are showing up for church. We decided that the best way to measure our experience was by using internal testimonials of how our congregation members are living through our values, rather than putting a solid metric to it. Other ways of living it out are actively using our values in staff hiring and committee appointments. This was something I hadn't really thought of, but when we bring people onto the council, or make sure that or people invest their time into committees, recognizing that they have an opportunity to live out that experience through the values that have been adopted. And then, of course, simply be involved. And, in reflecting on the relationship value, I think all these values, at least for me personally, are all very equal. But yes, sometimes there are those that, for one reason or another, like that relationship value, like Pastor Laura talked about earlier, it's the involvement and engagement that we have with each other that has special meaning. And then, of course, don't forget about those foundational scriptures. We spend a lot of time not just developing the specific wording and phrasing around the value statements, but identifying scripture text that serves as a foundation for each statement. And I'm glad that Jean spent a little time talking about that during the outreach portion of today's talk. Now, sharing externally. This one, of course, can always be somewhat challenging, but I think there are a few tools that can be used to help facilitate this. Of course, actively promote on the website and social media. We do have active social media. We do have a highly attractive website. We do include our mission statement and value statements, both current and past, on the website. So I think a lot of our church communications are doing a good job at promoting these values. Again, testimonials. This was an interesting one, and I'll admit that I borrowed a few thoughts and ideas from some strategies that are more corporate or on the business end. But it talked about, do your customers or do your partners or do they share your values? And so I thought, well, that's a good question. We should be actively promoting our values to those organizations that Jean identified that receive our benevolence, and say, we just want to let you know that what we stand for and why you're an important partner in our ministry. And then also promote our values to those that use our facilities. We're fortunate to have a number of organizations that come in and use classrooms and make sure that they recognize what it is that we value as a church congregation. So here are some important questions. There are a lot of important questions. I only put a few on here, but just a few that I thought I would invite people to think about. So we're talking about those values that we have collectively identified as a church congregation. And it got me to thinking, well, what are my personal values? And do my personal values intersect with the church values that we've identified? And so I could pose that rhetorically, and if at the end of the session you want to answer that for yourself, absolutely. And then, as I said, do they intersect with the values of St. Andrew's Lutheran? I think most of us would probably say yes. I mean, that's why we're all part of this community. But as I introduced at the very beginning of the presentation, there are some organizations that say may have a set of values, and say staff or employees don't even know what those values are. And once they learn what they are, they may say, well, those aren't my values. I don't share those same values. But I think it's safe to say that that what we have, we've been living out for some time. Where do I see Christ at work in living out these values? I think that's important for us as we, the value statements support the overall mission statement of coming together in Christ to love and serve all people. And I think that when you actively live out these values, or one at a time, see where Christ is at in that experience. And then what value do you most identify with and why? This was something that each of the presenters, when they were asked to focus on a given value, they each kind of gravitated toward one, and and you were seeing them expressing why that value is kind of a central component of their experience. So then we have some ideas here that we'll talk about too. What strategies will you use to live out these values? How can we build our values into our prayer life? Or do you, when you find that quiet moment during a day and you have you go to the Lord in prayer, is there something that you're specifically asking for help with in living out a value? And then what challenges do you anticipate in living out these values? one challenge that I've had from time to time is just having enough bandwidth to make sure that I can stream the service. So, but sometimes those are just physical barriers. So think about where you are challenged in living out these values, and what you can and where you can find strength later on. So that concludes that portion. I would like to thank Dick for taking the lead on this and for being the chair of the Mission and Values Committee. Thank you for your leadership, Dick, on helping us navigate through the mission and values exercise.
Other than that, I want to thank you for participating today and joining us in this conversation. And I know that our discussions and explorations of values will continue.